He was humiliated in a crowded cafe over his red MAGA hat, which he wore without a hint of embarrassment. An enraged woman called the police, loudly accusing him of provocation and aggression. But no one knew that this humble customer was the most influential person in the state. What happened next changed the lives of everyone involved forever. A sunny Monday morning, and the city was just starting to wake up. On the main street, a cozy cafe greeted customers with the mingling scents of freshly baked croissants and espresso. Kevin, a slender 35-year-old man with a short haircut and confident posture, stepped inside. He preferred having breakfast here every morning. The simple menu, friendly staff, and calm atmosphere made it the perfect spot. In his hand, he held a familiar red cap with the words, "Make America Great Again." The other customers barely noticed him. Elderly couples peacefully read newspapers, and young people were glued to their laptops. Only the barista, recognizing Kevin, waved cheerfully at him. He responded with a light smile, ordered a coffee and an omelette, and then sat by the window. Opening his newspaper, he immersed himself in reading, savoring the quiet. The calm didn't last long. The door swung open with a loud bang, and Karen entered. She was impossible to ignore. Her bright outfit, massive bag, and commanding gaze made it seem like she was about to issue instructions to the entire staff. Karen, a woman in her 50s with the energy to sweep away everything in her path, had a mission: to fix the injustices of the world. Today, she had found one. Her eyes landed on Kevin. She froze as if she had spotted an unsightly stain in an otherwise perfect picture. Karen practically boiled over. The red cap seemed to shout a personal challenge at her. Narrowing her eyes, she marched straight to his table. "Are you serious?" she said loudly, her voice cutting through the air and drawing the attention of everyone in the cafe. "This is a cafe, not a place for your—" She paused, glaring at the cap. "Propaganda!" Kevin slowly looked up from his newspaper, as though doubting that the remark was directed at him. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, offering a polite smile. Karen hadn't expected such a calm response. Her face reddened, not with embarrassment, but with anger. She plopped her bag onto the nearest table, crossed her arms, and stared down at Kevin as though she were a general preparing to reprimand a soldier. "Do you realize that hat offends people? Did you ever think that someone might not like seeing it?" "It's just a hat," Kevin replied, leaning back in his chair. "Do you always start your mornings with lectures?" His unshaken composure was like gasoline on Karen's fire. "It's not just a hat," she exclaimed, her voice growing louder. "It's a symbol of hate, and you know it. People like you are ruining this society." Several patrons began to turn their heads, some out of curiosity, others with mild irritation. In the corner, a young couple discreetly started filming the scene on their phone. Kevin glanced at the spectators before returning his gaze to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm just having breakfast. Maybe you should try it too." The remark, delivered with an unbothered tone, left Karen speechless for a moment. Her face flushed even deeper, and she took a step closer, pointing an accusatory finger at Kevin's cap. "I'm not going to let you just sit here as if nothing's wrong." "That's not your call, is it?" he replied, smiling faintly. "Or am I mistaken? Are you the owner of this cafe?" Karen opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the cafe's owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hernandez, intervened. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said politely, "but what seems to be the problem?" "This man," Karen practically shouted, pointing at Kevin. "He's ruining the atmosphere with his appearance." Mrs. Hernandez glanced from Karen to Kevin, her expression puzzled. "I'm sorry, but he's one of our regulars," she said. "If you don't like it here, perhaps another cafe would suit you better." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. She inhaled sharply as though preparing for another tirade, but instead pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. You'll see that I'm right." The cafe fell silent. Kevin calmly sipped his coffee, folded his newspaper, and gave Mrs. Hernandez a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mrs. Hernandez," he said. "Breakfast was excellent, as always." Karen now became the center of attention in the cafe. as though she'd won the grand prize in a drama lottery. Her voice grew louder, her gestures more exaggerated, and her words sounded like the impassioned closing argument of a courtroom lawyer. She aimed her phone at Kevin, as if recording an episode of her own reality show. "People like you are ruining this country," she shouted, glaring at Kevin. "It's disgraceful, and everyone here should know it." Kevin, who had just taken another sip of his coffee, calmly set the cup down on its saucer. "People like me," he replied with a faint smile, "just want to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, her phone shaking in her hand. She turned to the other patrons, seeking support. "Do you see this? This man dares to sit here in public wearing that hat." The other customers exchanged glances. Some smirked, others tried to suppress laughter, and a few discreetly continued filming. "If my hat bothers you so much, ma'am," Kevin said, "why not just look the other way?" Karen recoiled as if he had suggested something indecent. Her indignation reached new heights. "That's it," she declared, pressing a button on her phone. "I'm calling the police." Mrs. Hernandez grew pale and tried to intervene. "Ma'am, please. He's just sitting here drinking coffee." "Just?" Karen snapped. "People like him are a threat to our society." Kevin, unable to resist, gestured toward his plate. "The only thing I'm threatening here is my omelet, and it seems okay with that." The quip drew a few chuckles from the crowd, but Karen, oblivious, made her call. "Yes, police," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "There's a man here causing a public disturbance. Yes, it's the cafe on 5th and Main. Please hurry." The cafe fell into a tense silence. Kevin leaned back in his chair, glancing at Karen with faint amusement. "This should be interesting," he said lightly. "I hope they bring donuts." The comment drew stifled laughter from the barista, but Karen stood resolutely, her hands on her hips, awaiting the arrival of justice. A patrol car rolled to a stop in front of the cafe, the fading sound of its siren adding to the tense silence inside. 2 police officers stepped out and walked through the cafe doors. Karen immediately rushed toward them, waving her arms as if conducting her own personal symphony of justice. "Officers!" she cried, her voice carrying across the entire room. "It's him! This man is a danger to society!" The taller of the 2 officers, Sergeant Rodriguez, a solidly built man with a weary expression, raised an eyebrow. His younger partner, Officer McLean, looked slightly confused but remained professional. "What exactly did he do?" Rodriguez asked calmly. Karen, practically glowing with self-righteousness, gestured dramatically toward Kevin. He's wearing that disgusting hat. It's a symbol of hate. And he was rude. I felt threatened." The officers turned their attention to Kevin, who was seated calmly at his table, his coffee now lukewarm. Rodriguez shifted his gaze back to Karen. "So he threatened you? Got physical? Raised his voice?" "Well, no, but—" Karen faltered, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "His presence is offensive to everyone here." McLean, unable to hide a faint smirk, asked, "So, his crime is sitting quietly at a table?" Karen's face turned red with frustration. "You don't understand. People like him are dangerous. He needs to leave." Kevin, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. His voice was calm and measured. "Officers, I'm sorry for the trouble, but I'm just here drinking coffee. Am I allowed to continue, or do I need to call a lawyer to defend my right to breakfast?" McLean barely suppressed a chuckle, while Rodriguez simply shook his head in mild disbelief. But then Rodriguez's expression shifted as he studied Kevin's face more closely. "Hold on," Rodriguez said, taking a step closer. "Isn't this Mr. Jackson?" Karen froze, her confidence draining instantly. "Who?" she whispered, glancing nervously at the other patrons, who were now watching the scene with bated breath. Rodriguez ignored Karen and turned to McLean. "This is the governor of the state, right?" Kevin raised a hand in a casual wave. "You got it. Nice to meet you, Sergeant." The cafe erupted in a wave of gasps and murmurs. Karen's mouth fell open, her face a mixture of disbelief and horror. "You're the governor?" she managed to stammer. "But why? Why are you wearing that hat?" Kevin smiled, his expression serene. Because it's my hat, and because it's not your job to decide what I wear. Rodriguez turned to Karen, his tone growing colder. Ma'am, your call to the police was completely unnecessary. You've wasted our time and resources. I suggest you apologize. Karen's face turned pale, her lips trembling. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for support, but found only disapproving stares. I didn't know, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Kevin gave her a polite nod, still unfazed. Hopefully now you'll understand that labels don't always reflect reality. Karen seemed to shrink under the weight of her own embarrassment, as if her words had turned into chains she couldn't escape. Scattered chuckles broke out among the patrons, and someone even began clapping lightly. Karen took a step back, lowered her head, and hurried toward the exit, muttering under her breath. I didn't know. Kevin finished his coffee, set the cup on its saucer, and stood up. Thank you for your service, officers, he said, extending a hand to Rodriguez, who shook it firmly. Always at your service, Governor, Rodriguez replied with a respectful nod. Kevin turned to the patrons, offering them a parting nod as well. Then, as he reached the door, he paused, glancing back. Remember, folks, he said with a faint smile, don't judge someone by their hat. The cafe erupted into applause as Kevin walked out with a quiet smile, leaving the cafe with a new story to talk about for days to come. Karen stood frozen in the doorway of the cafe, still stunned and clearly struggling to gather her thoughts. Meanwhile, murmurs and whispers began to fill the room as people who had recorded the incident started sending their videos to friends and uploading them to social media. One patron, smirking, remarked sarcastically, "This will hit the trending page before you even make it home." Kevin, remaining calm, walked toward the exit. He paused at the doorway and turned to give Karen a final look. Don't judge people by their hats, ma'am. Next time, try talking to them instead of putting on a show. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. She could see from the faces around her that no one was on her side. Instead of offering an apology, she clutched her phone tightly and hurried out of the cafe, her head low. The police officers, who had begun leaving, turned back briefly to address her. Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez said firmly, a false police report is a serious offense. You could face a fine. We recommend you think twice before doing something like this again. Karen nodded nervously, muttering something about good intentions. Mrs. Hernandez, the cafe owner, watched her with an unmistakable look of irritation. And please, Mrs. Hernandez said, her voice sharp, don't come back here again. We don't need this kind of circus in our cafe. Later that day, the videos from the cafe went viral, racking up hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of comments. Some people laughed at the absurdity of the situation, while others criticized Karen for her behavior. The most popular comment summed it up perfectly. When you think you're fighting for justice, but you're really just fighting toast. Memes featuring Karen quickly spread across the internet. One showed her pointing dramatically at Kevin's hat with the caption, "Justice and pepper spray, Karen's morning routine." Another joked, "When you go to a cafe for breakfast but leave with a lesson on tolerance." Karen's newfound fame wasn't the kind she'd hoped for. Kevin, on the other hand, became the hero of the day. That evening, he gave a brief interview to a local newspaper. Calm and thoughtful, he shared his perspective. We live in a challenging time where people are often judged by their appearance or the symbols they wear. But respect for one another is the foundation of any society. If this story helps remind people of that, then I'm glad it happened. The cafe where the incident took place saw an unexpected boost in business. Curious customers flocked to Governor Kevin's cafe, many of them eager to sit at the governor's table and become part of the story. Mrs. Hernandez even added a new item to the menu. The governor's breakfast, a croissant, an omelette, and a side of coffee. As for Karen, the fallout was more difficult. Her colleagues whispered about the incident behind her back, and neighbors began avoiding her. What had started as her attempt to make things right had turned into a humiliating lesson. Still, Perhaps it served as a turning point for her. Sometimes, silence and respect speak louder than any argument. And as one patron later reflected, you never know who's sitting under that hat. It might just be an ordinary person, or it might be the governor. Either way, it's better to choose respect from the start.